Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. We have two interviews of David Benatar and two pieces by Emile Torres, plus an academic paper. So let's get started. A very short correspondence between Katherine D and David Benatar was published on Katherine's blog. There were only four questions centered around pro-mortalist positions of killing existing life, which Benatar rejected strongly. He was also asked about Efilism. While you have addressed pro-mortalism, Efilism seems to occupy a middle ground, advocating for elimination of life but through different reasoning. Do you view Efilism as a distinct philosophical position worth engaging with, or do you see it as another variant of the pro-mortalism you reject? Benatar says either Efilism embodies pro-mortalism or it does not. If it does, then it does not occupy middle ground. If it does not embody pro-mortalism, I struggle to see how it differs from antinatalism. I don't think that talk about Efilism is helpful, and I would recommend dropping it. Katherine has also appeared on a podcast called The Unspeakable Podcast, where she talked about AI, antinatalism, and incels. The podcast is hosted by Megan Daum, but since it is behind paywall, I have not been able to listen to it. If you are one of her subscribers and have listened to it, please let me know what was discussed. That David Benatar's correspondence with Katherine was short, but there was also a long and very interesting textual interview of David Benatar on cators.cat. Original interview is in Catalan language, but I Google translated it into English. There are in total 42 questions, which include Benatar's views on sex, his second sexism, his views on our treatment to other animals, etc. But a large portion is dedicated to antinatalism. It goes to some depth into his axiological asymmetry as well as quality of life argument. The whole interaction is fantastic, and I wish I could make a video just reading through all of that, but in the interest of time, here are some snippets as a glimpse. Benatar says all misery, all unhappiness, all inequality, all discrimination, everything that concerns us in the realm of ethics, philosophy, and human inquiry is based on the existence of people. In a sense, the question of antinatalism is the most fundamental question that can be asked. On misanthropic argument, he says the child, the one which we would decide to bring into existence if we do decide to have them, will have an immense negative impact on the environment, will cause a great deal of suffering if he eats animals, and will harm other people in very ordinary ways. Humans are profoundly imperfect. Asked about how he would describe the treatment that animals currently receive on planet Earth, he replies, horrible. There are billions of animals that we as humans torture and kill every year. We subject them to horrible living conditions and then slaughter them, often in very painful ways and large numbers. There is nothing that can justify it. Overall, it is really very interesting and very good interview. Abel Capdevila does a very good job of interrogating Dr. Benatar instead of just accepting his answers. A Tale of Two Extinctions is a recent article by Emile Torres. Torres compares two types of extinctions sought by two different, almost opposing groups of people. In case of human extinction, we can imagine two scenarios. In one scenario, there are no individual humans left. Here, individual humans mean those animals who are members of the species Homo sapiens. So, in this scenario, once they are gone, that's it. There is no successor to our species forever. This is final extinction. In the second scenario, there are no humans left, but there are some other individuals who carry on the legacy of humans. These could be genetically modified humanoids or super intelligent AIs. These are called post-humans. So here, humans that we know as of today have gone, and so our species is extinct, but we have left post-humans behind. This is called terminal extinction. Torres claims that Efilists, pro-mortalists, and negative utilitarians want to have final extinction. On the other hand, the Silicon Valley techno-futurists, long-termists, and accelerationists want to have a terminal extinction. These groups are called tescrial. They want humans to go extinct but post-humans to continue to exist. And since final extinction entails terminal extinction, both groups are aligned in seeing no place for Homo sapiens in their preferred futures. This is the common denominator that qualifies them as pro-extinctionists. This is an interesting observation, two opposing views seemingly having same goal. Now, Dr. Torres is an expert on extinction, or at least released Human Extinction. They have written a big, thick book on the subject and have studied this topic extensively. And I am nowhere near to them in this aspect, but still I thought there is some superficiality in this commonality. One, Dr. Torres does not include antinatalists in the group that wants to bring about human extinction. You could argue that antinatalism is only about not bringing new lives into existence and not necessarily about extinction. And that is true, but it is also true that antinatalists would accept extinction as a preferable option compared to the endless continuation of species. David Benatar dedicates an entire chapter in Better Never to Have Been on extinction. Secondly, the reasons why antinatalists prefer extinction, whenever they prefer extinction, has to do with harm of coming into existence and suffering of individuals. On the other hand, textialists, that is, those techno-futurist bros, see individuals as a means to fulfill their techno-utopian goals. For them, the survival of our species matters only insofar as it's necessary to give birth to our successors. Otherwise, our species is as disposable as a placenta. So we have one group which focuses on ethical considerations of individuals and thinks of species as a collective result, whereas the other group thinks primarily in terms of species and treats individuals as mere means. This, I think, is a big difference. Not only that, but in their own opposition to extinction, Dr. Torres themselves seems to lose focus from the individual, where they say, if you, like me, value our species and believe that despite our many profound flaws, we should survive and flourish, the sudden rise in pro-extinctionist sentiments should unsettle you. Notice the phrase value our species. That raises the question, why should we value our species and to what extent? Is that value overriding the harm caused to billions of individuals? If so, what creates that value? Is it the case that our species is intrinsically valuable, which seems speciesist and almost anti-Darwinian? Some philosophers like Todd may have argued that things like art, music, culture are intrinsically valuable. Is that the value of our species Dr. Torres is referring to? If it is, then can that not be preserved by post-humans? On the other hand, if one gives preference to individuals over species, then the first question that needs to be asked is, will those post-humans be sentient, or can they evolve into sentient beings? If they are not going to be sentient, then antinatalists would not mind them being around and making copies of themselves. These important points are missing from Torres' article. Similar comparison between techno-futurists and anti-procreative extinctionists was also made in a podcast called Dystopia Now, which Emile Torres hosts along with Kate Willett. In their latest episode, Pro-Natalism, Anti-Natalism and Efilism, was invited Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna was National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign. She is a lawyer and a political commentator and hosts a podcast of her own called Bad Faith Podcast. Anyway, in this particular episode, which was 90 minutes long, Emile introduced many philosophical concepts to Briahna. They did it in a way I would not agree with, but there were some interesting takeaways. For example, at one point, Briahna herself called natalism a Ponzi scheme. She also agreed in principle with veganism, although she is not a vegan in practice. So did Emile Torres, who said they are an aspiring vegan. And then at around 1 hour 16 minutes mark, both Emile Torres and Briahna agreed to some version of the red button experiment, even though Torres seems to be critical of pro-extinctionist positions and wants our species to continue. And there was also news that Torres is working on an academic paper which talks about suffering in the world. Talking of extinction, Lawrence made a video on human extinction. It is actually a part of his series on arguments listed in the Anti-Natalist handbook. The argument in this video is, if we stop reproducing, then humans would go extinct and therefore we should have children, assuming going extinct is a bad thing. Lawrence debunks this argument in this quick and short video, which is just less than 2 minutes long. He also had a long video on existence bias. In it, he goes through what existence bias is, where it comes from, and how it influences us. He also talks about existence bias and its connection to optimism bias and how the combination of both leads us to reproduce. It's an interesting video with some good references to works of Thomas Metzinger. Here's a tragic news about tech bros and their breeding. The founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, has revealed that he has produced more than 100 children through his sperm donation. He made a will to distribute all his wealth equally among all those children. Pavel has 6 children of his own from 3 women, meaning the ones he actively fathers instead of just through sperm donations. I think it is deeply narcissistic to give your wealth to some 100 children you have never met just because they carry your genes. There was a paper From Abstinence to Assistance, Anti-Natalism's Unexpected Endorsement of the Principle of Procreative Beneficence by Marcus L. Teo. In its simplest form, antinatalism is the view that having children is morally wrong. That is not the definition of antinatalism, as there are many other aspects within antinatalism, but for the context of this paper, this is the normative view. However, we know that people are not going to stop having children just because of some philosophical arguments. But Marcus says that does not mean that we should reject antinatalism so hastily. The arguments for antinatalism can still inform those who are willing to have children. Sounds contradictory, but he talks about a principle called Principle of Procreative Beneficence, or PPB in short. This was proposed by Julian Savulescu, and according to this principle, couples or single reproducers should select the child of the possible children they could have who is expected to have the best life, or at least as good a life as the others, based on the relevant available information. So let's say in the case of IVF procedure, you have two embryos. Embryo A, which is a better life embryo, meaning if implanted, it will have a better life than embryo B, which will have worse life. Note that embryo B will produce worse life than embryo A, but it will still be worth living if started. In such a case, principle of procreative beneficence tells us that we should select embryo A and reject embryo B, because given the possible children, embryo A will produce best life. Now, there are objections to this principle. One is, how do you define what best life is? It may not always be the well-being of the person. For many people, religious devotion produces the best life even if it may not contain maximum possible welfare for them. Or a stoic could insulate the struggles caused by genetic disadvantages and still lead best possible life. Or in other cases, some impediments might actually give meaning to their life, inspiring them to live best life. Then there is the problem of subjective experiences. Embryo B may have suboptimal genes but might still produce a person who experiences life much deeper than one produced by embryo A. And then there is this non-identity problem. Embryo B could not be said to be worse off than it would have been, because in case of its rejection, it would not have been in the first place. So with these objections to the principle of procreative beneficence, what do? People are still going to have children, but antinatalism can provide a different way to guide them to choose which child they should have. That's because arguments for antinatalism are based on harms or risks of harms that may be caused to the child. Well, at least some of the arguments are. Marcus refers to Benatar's threshold while starting a new life, which is usually higher than the threshold we use for stopping an existing life. And he also refers to Mati Hairi's lack of need to take risks of harm while starting such a life, and Shauna Schifrin's consent, which cannot be obtained or assumed. And since we bring our children without their consent, we owe them more than just a life worth living. That's why, although abstinence from procreation is preferable, if a child is created, then the least we could do is to ensure that the harm that we impose upon the child is adequately taken care of, broadly construed. This shift from best life to the reduced harm or suffering is what produces the antinatalist corollary of the principle of procreative beneficence, according to which couples or single reproducers should select the child of the possible children they could have who is expected to experience the least amount of suffering in life or the lowest risk of significant suffering in life among the set of embryos based on the relevant available information. Based on this, we can reject embryo B, which is susceptible to more harm relative to embryo A, owing to its suboptimal genes. That's because embryo B cannot lament failing to be brought into the world if it were not implanted. However, it can reasonably lament the suffering that it encounters in the future if it were implanted, even if it evaluates its life as worth living on the whole. So here we are. You don't have to be an antinatalist, but antinatalist pressures, as Marcus calls them, can still guide you to make correct decisions in choosing which children to have. If we are to have children at all, as antinatalists are happy to admit that we will despite their arguments, then we should want to reduce the kinds of suffering that antinatalists raise to at least attempt to alleviate the suffering that comes with procreation. And the news is there is more to come from Marcus on this. He tweeted, "This piece is the first to be published in a series of projects that studies downstream upshots from antinatalism." Here's a news indirectly related to antinatalism. MPs in the UK's Parliament Westminster have voted to decriminalise abortion in England and Wales. In a free vote, meaning there was no party whip for MPs to vote in a certain way, an overwhelming majority of 379 MPs voted in favour and 137 against decriminalising abortion. To be clear, abortion is legal in England and Wales, but it has some rules. Like you have to get approval from 2 doctors and you can abort only within 24 weeks of gestation and so on. Women who don't follow these rules were subject to legal actions against them. This new bill, once passed into law, will exempt such women from being prosecuted. The medical professionals who assist in such abortions would still face the threat of prosecution. This is a good news because those women who do have late-term abortions don't have it for fun. They are already going through serious mental and physical suffering. To subject them to police investigation and court proceedings is torturous. In June 2023, for example, Carla Foster was sentenced to 28 months in prison for terminating a pregnancy between 32 and 34 weeks. Similarly, Bethany Cox in 2024 was charged for illegal abortions. Although she was cleared after a court case, her lawyer had said she had been interviewed by police in the throes of grief and had been investigated for 3 years. So this new bill brings a big relief to women like Bethany and Carla. However, whether terminating after the stipulated period is ethical or not is a different question. I would guess that between philosophers who are pro-abortion, there would be a divide. David Benatar, for example, would oppose abortion after sentience has developed in fetus. But someone like Christopher Belshaw is likely to approve it. Anyway, still a historic moment for women in England and Wales. Finally, I leave you with this Portuguese video which talks about Benatar's antinatalism. It's probably an AI voiceover video in Portuguese, but you can watch it auto-dubbed in English. The channel Abel Pataka has 86,000 subscribers, so it is good that antinatalism is talked about on these big channels and in multiple languages. So those were the stories for this week. See you next time.